It's always the obvious questions that are so vigorously discouraged. And one of the questions that's been the most discouraged over the past 30 years are, what are those lines in the sky that you see trailing jets? What is that? Some people call them chemtrails, claim that somehow the U.S. government is spraying poison on the population. Those people are clearly crazy. Wikipedia calls them crazy. Every news outlet calls them crazy. But the trails are still there. And it's clearly not water vapor, because that doesn't make sense at all. So what are they? We've spent the last 6 months trying to find someone credible who could explain that to us. A serious, sane person with an engineering background who could tell us, what are we looking at? Because we're looking at something. And I don't care what names you call me. I still want to know what it is. And we think we have found that person. Dane Wigington of Northern California has been on this subject for almost 30 years and has compiled what we believe, after looking at it pretty carefully, is the most comprehensive account of what we're seeing. And it's very bad. Dane, thanks a lot for joining us. I never knew what to think of this topic, chemtrails or contrails, or the stripes in the sky that linger after airplanes pass. I don't remember them as a child. They're very common now. I've heard people say there's something nefarious going on. So I go to Wikipedia to see what they say, and I want to read you the Wikipedia entry, the first part of it, on this question, okay? You may have seen this, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia as of this morning. The chemtrail conspiracy theory is the erroneous belief that long-lasting condensation trails left in the sky by high-flying aircraft are actually, quote, chemtrails, consisting of chemical or biological agents sprayed for nefarious purposes undisclosed to the general public, period. Believers in this conspiracy theory say that while normal contrails dissipate relatively quickly, contrails that linger must contain additional substances. Those who subscribe to the theory speculate that the purpose of the chemical release may be solar radiation management, weather modification, psychological manipulation, human population control, biological or chemical warfare, or testing of a biological or chemical agent on the population, and that the trails are causing respiratory illnesses and other health problems. So I read that, and the purpose, of course, of that paragraph is not to illuminate what this might be, but to attack anyone who speculates about what it might be. It's a form itself of psychological warfare, of propaganda. And when I read that, I said to myself, there's clearly something going on, because the people who control Wikipedia, which would be the intel agencies, as we know, don't want anyone to talk about this. So with that lengthy preface explaining why this conversation is taking place, I will turn it over to you to explain, what are these lines in the sky that we have all seen?
There's sprayed particulate dispersion. There is no theory in this equation. Bottom line is, when we have up-close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, KC-10s, KC-135s, C-17 Globemasters, with nozzles visible turning dispersions on and off. This is not, quote, condensation. Geoengineeringwatch.org is the only entity that has taken a NOAA flying lab, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab, top scientists in it, to sample what these heavy aircraft are emitting at altitude. That sample was processed at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, one of the world's most renowned testing institutions. We found exactly what we knew we would find, starting with aluminum nanoparticles. Bioavailable freeform aluminum is toxic to all life, period. That element is named in numerous climate engineering patents as part of a geoengineering dispersion element. So again, there's no theory involved in any of this. And what's so incredibly profound in this equation, Tucker, you have the entire global climate science community, governments all over the world saying we need to put aircraft in the air immediately to disperse light scattering particles. And we use the science terms at geoengineeringwatch.org because the chemtrails term is the instant marginalization term by design. You bring that term up, any elected official won't talk to you anymore. Media will immediately marginalize you. Solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement, climate engineering. If we stick to the science terms, they can't marginalize us. So again, this elephant in the sky that we are told is a conspiracy theory is exactly what the entire global climate science community says we need to deploy immediately to slow down the warming of the planet. Stated purpose to deflect some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. We know these programs, not surprisingly, are making a bad situation worse, not better. And, Tucker, they're being used as a form of warfare. And we know that. We have countries like Iran, constantly demonized, of course, as you well know. Immediately after 9/11, we have the list of countries to be targeted given to General Wesley Clark, a list that clearly existed before 9/11 even occurred. Subsequently, every one of those countries, every one of them endured a once in 1,000 year drought. Statistically, mathematically, that's impossible without climate intervention operations. And we have the leader of Iran on the floor of the UN, on film, on the record, stating NATO was cutting off their precipitation. We have Iranian top scientists recently stating NATO's been doing this for 40 years. Destabilize the food supply by destabilizing the rain, and you destabilize the population.
So you just said a bunch of amazing things, all of which I just want to say sound plausible to me. But let's just back up a little bit. So you're calling this geoengineering. The term chemtrails, you say, is a propaganda term designed to discredit people who ask sincere questions about what the hell am I looking at. So,
correct, because if they Google that term, they'll get what you got. And that's what we try to avoid. If anybody is unfamiliar with the issue and they Google that term, that's the end of their search, most likely. So we try to point chess, semantics matter in this case.
Okay, so the first line of the Wikipedia entry points out something true, which is that when you look at these lines in the sky and you're told, well, it's just condensation, it's water vapor, you know that maybe that's not the right explanation because water vapor dissipates and doesn't remain in the sky for like 20 minutes after the plane leaves. So that suggests bigger particles in the mist, that particulate matter in the mist. Is that correct?
Exactly correct. If you see, for example, breath condensing, if you see some researchers in the Arctic and their breath is condensing because it's very cold, do they get a cloud starting to form over their head? If you have a vehicle that's exhaust is condensing in the morning, you have a freeway with giant clouds hanging over it from the condensation from the vehicles in some cold region? No, that's not how condensation behaves. And again, my journey into this whole battle of now 27 years, but when I built my off-grid home in Northern California, middle of the wilderness, it was the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. I have solar, wind, and hydro. And I was losing on some days from what these aircraft are emitting 50, 60, even 70% of my solar uptake from what these aircraft were emitting. I knew that could not be condensation. When I began to research, I was very surprised at the mountain of information on geoengineering, solar radiation management. And I looked for primary elements. I began to test my precipitation. I hoped I would not find these elements in my rain because I knew if I did, it would change the entire course of my life. I cannot look the other way. I came up with 7 parts per billion in my first rain test over the next 18 months because I took that long in researching before I was willing to speak out on this issue. At the end of 18 months, I had single rain events with 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum in my rain. This is bioavailable free-form aluminum, which is toxic to all life forms, period. Primary element named in climate engineering patents, and we have the world's most recognized geoengineers specifically stating on film, on the record, their goal of using aluminum in these programs because of its high reflectivity with no consideration of the consequences. That's how I got into this battle.
So if I understand what you're saying, what we're watching is an attempt, I assume by governments, and we'll get into who's doing this, to mitigate the effects of climate change, to reflect back rays from the sun so that the earth doesn't warm at a pace that is dangerous to whatever they think it's dangerous to. But this is a global warming mitigation effort. Is that correct?
That is the stated purpose. We know this is...
That is the stated purpose. So I think that's plausible because there is so much energy, commitment, sincere commitment in some cases, obviously fake commitment in others, and so much money behind this effort to mitigate global warming that makes absolute sense. It is a religion. And you're saying that you were not originally aware of this or interested in it, but because you live off grid and you derive a lot of your electricity from solar and you clearly have an engineer brain, you were wondering, like, why the hell is my solar not working correctly? And that got you into this process of learning about it?
correct. And I have friends in the solar industry and who, off the record, inform me that some of the commercial solar plants are producing half their design output. And they won't talk about why, because they don't want to lose subsidies. So again, this is a very known element in many fields. In fact, with the nation's weathermen, National Weather Service, and NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, there is an illegal federal gag order on all agency operations with those two entities. Why would our government feel the need to gag the weathermen? I had a NOAA scientist state to my face, quote, "We all know this is going on. We have no First Amendment protection. We don't know what to do." So the bottom line is, let's all just pretend this isn't going on while it's virtually dismantling the planet's primary life support systems and ubiquitously contaminating everything everywhere. I'm not just talking about aluminum. We have in lab tests. And again, we've done hundreds of lab tests. We did 500 working with the University of Minnesota, an internationally recognized agricultural institution. We have aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, surfactants, polymer fibers, graphene, all of this coming down in our breathable air column, Tucker.
That's horrifying. So who's doing this specifically?
Ultimately, all roads lead to those who print the money. But we know, as far as the coordinating entities, certainly DOD, DARPA, and we have documents to prove the existence of these programs going back decades, documents hundreds of pages long. We have an 800-page U.S. Senate document from 1978 outlining the scope and scale of these programs then, specifically calling for intergovernmental cooperation, even between, quote, otherwise adversarial nations, because of the cross-border ramifications of these programs. You can't just geoengineer over your own country. Who's the biggest player? Obviously, the United States of America, because of the size of our military. The U.S. military has 3 times more aerial tankers, which are the primary aircraft used in these operations, 3 times more than all other militaries in the world combined. And if I could back up to the whole condensation trail narrative again, which is perhaps one of the greatest lies ever perpetrated on populations all over the world, all military tankers and all commercial aircraft are equipped with what's known as a high bypass turbofan jet engine. That's a jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through that engine is not combusted. So by design, that engine is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances, which are diminishing by the day because of the warming that's occurring in the troposphere. So much warming. We've had 2 former military pilots that fly private aircraft. Important people have contacted us at geoengineeringwatch.org. In both cases, they were off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, and their aircraft were forced into emergency auto descents because the air outside that aircraft was 45 to 50 degrees above what it should have been. The air was not dense enough to carry those aircraft. These people are very, very alarmed, but very afraid to speak out.
Well, that's an amazing fact. And it points up something that I think is indisputably true, which is the climate is changing. Why it's changing is a whole separate set of debates. Of course, it's always changed.
Climate engineering alone, though, if I could elaborate, climate engineering alone, I'm not negating the other sources of damage to the planet. We've been very poor stewards. But our point at geoengineeringwatch.org is, how can anybody from any perspective, and the environmental left is the most reluctant to face this issue. And we know why, Tucker, because they don't want to lose their 501c3 nonprofits. Our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org spoke to attorneys from every major environmental group, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, WWF, all of them. They will not address this issue because they don't want to lose their nonprofit status. Is that not criminal hypocrisy? So we're stating in the case of trapping more heat than it deflects, causing far more harm than any perceived good, they're simply using it as a weapon under the guise of trying to mitigate the climate. So again, these operations are taking us from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. So again, the greatest, most damaging form of human activity on the planet at this moment in time must be considered these operations, climate engineering.
Well, sure. Geoengineering by its very nature is just like textbook hubris, where you think you're God and you're in charge of the weather and the planet. No, you're just some lumpy, furry schmuck living out an incredibly short lifespan with no ability to make anything better because you're not God. The whole mindset is the mindset that gets us to nuclear war. So I'm opposed to it on those grounds. But before we ascend too much higher, let's just come back down a little bit and to the specifics. So Where these aircraft seem to be everywhere in the United States. Where are they taking off from? Where do these chemicals come from? The aluminum particulate, the rest that you did, the magnesium, all the rest you described. Like what's kind of the chain that gets us to the stripes in the sky that we see?
Aircraft are taking off from countless locations. We're aware of a number of military bases where we know they're deploying from. We also have commercial aircraft with commercial markings that we know are being used in these operations. We know that because we have film footage of these aircraft, retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons. We have up-close photographs aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make this look like, quote, condensation. We are not implicating commercial pilots or personnel, but we are communicating with them. Some commercial pilots that distribute our printed materials in pilot lunchrooms, for example, covertly, because they know their aircraft are being used. These are automated systems. They carry a small payload. You might remember about in the year 2000, the weight of the aircraft became a very big deal, how much luggage you carried on, how much weight you carried on. That appears to be when this was implemented. And we also know that the DoD has leased a significant number of commercial aircraft with commercial markings. Why would the DoD need or want that? And again, for the base material, because we're talking about an extraordinary amount of material here, based on our testing with the University of Minnesota, again, about 500 lab tests there, and extrapolating how much material was in the precipitation, projecting that globally, it appears something in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of nanoparticles are being dispersed annually in skies all over the globe. And the smaller the particle, the more toxic it is, the more harmful it is, the more bioavailable it is. And all the official air quality testing by design doesn't even look for these elements, let alone disclose them. So official air quality testing is PM10, 10 microns, occasionally PM2.5. Those are boulders compared to a nanoparticle. You can fit up to 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a single human hair. They're inconceivably small. And the reason they use such small particles is because they stay aloft longer. And that's the goal. Keep the particles suspended in the atmosphere. And there's more volumetric forcing. There's more surface area the smaller the particle for a given amount of material. So it appears, and we have a published study on this, there is a peer-reviewed published study that implicates coal fly ash as a base material for these operations because it contains many of the elements the climate engineers feel they need to disperse in our skies, and it provides plausible deniability, and it gets rid of a waste product that they're always trying to get rid of. There's other elements added. American Elements Corporation appears to be one of the primary suppliers for these operations. But again, the fact that this can go on in our skies and the mountain of data that exists on this and the continued pretending by the so-called climate science community that this is ongoing is mind-numbing, and they won't be able to hide this for much longer, Tucker. I want to stress that. These programs will be forced to light. And if I could end with this, when those pretend, again, like the Wikipedia definition you read, that this is some sort of an outlandish conspiracy. Let's go all the way back to 1962. 63 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson on film, on the record, ranting like a lunatic. It's the first 30 seconds of the weekly commercial-free, non-political Geoengineering Watch national broadcast we put on radios out of our stations out of our pocket across the country. But the first 30 seconds is this film footage of Johnson stating we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then. And, quote, he who controls the weather controls the world. How far have they come since?
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather. And he who controls the weather will control the world.
Well, it's that kind of lunatic hubris that, destroys the world. And Johnson was, of course, whether he knew it or not, committed to helping destroy the world. So an evil man, I think, by any metric. So I'm not necessarily surprised. What I am surprised by, however, is the fact that this program, the one you're describing, could have continued for over 60 years at this scale, continental scale, global scale. And no one knows about it or talks about it. I mean, we have a huge government, lots of elected officials. Like, what do they say when you ask them?
This is a bit like the safe and effective narrative, isn't it? Let's all have the entire medical community pretending that injecting toxic heavy metals is safe and effective. And they still pretend to this day that that is the case, when it doesn't take a large intellect or an educated individual to understand that's going to do harm. And yet that narrative still continues to this day. So again, this mass psychosis of denial is mind-numbing, but you can't hide this for much longer. And we do have the climate science community now starting to speak out, starting to state how incredibly catastrophic these programs would be if they were implemented. They're not outright admitting it yet, but they're getting closer. And if we look at historical precedent, when did the U.S. military start its modification in hurricanes? And there's some interesting things going on the hurricane front this year, as in none of them. They're being deflected. And people that pretend that you can't manipulate a weather system of that size, that's absolute nonsense. The science completely disputes that. U.S. military commenced its hurricane modification operations in 1947 with Project Cirrus. And even the results of that initial small-scale testing appeared to have so much effect on a cyclonic rotation that there were lawsuits pending from that, at which time they began to be more covert about their operations.
And you said you'll notice that there aren't hurricanes in Florida. So the last few years, Florida, the west coast of Florida in particular, just been hammered, absolutely destroyed. Billions, tens of billions of dollars of damage done by hurricanes, no hurricanes this year. And you're saying that that's not an accident. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we know the technology exists to steer storms of that size. And let me make a comparison. You could have a 10-year-old child divert the course of a 100,000-ton freight train by pulling a lever, literally, and changing the tracks.
That's correct.
And that's the kind of small input, massive output that you can have with these cyclonic rotations when they have the ability to manipulate atmospheric pressure zones. This is undisputed, patented science. So why would we think they're not using these type of operations? We have historical precedent. Project Popeye in Vietnam was so successful at controlling precipitation. This is a historical record that by 1976, they passed the INMOD treaties forbidding weather manipulation for wartime purposes, but not over a country's own population. So if we look at the
Can I ask you to stop? I'm sorry. You're throwing.
Please.
I'm so ignorant on this topic, but I'm suddenly very interested that I just want to make sure we don't miss anything. Operation Popeye, is that what you called it in Vietnam?
Correct. Correct.
I've never even heard of that. I'm embarrassed to say. What is it? What was it?
Very easily researched historical record. U.S. military was so successful at controlling precipitation over Vietnam that the international community was very concerned about this, at least on the surface. And they passed environmental modification treaties in 1976, international treaties forbidding weather manipulation in wartime. So again, when people claim this is conspiracy, we don't have this kind of power and control, and they try to muddy the climate engineering issue as being the localized, publicized cloud seeding operations. Those are two completely different animals. And we see even some state legislators doing the same. And we're trying to correct that at geoengineering.org because we're working with numerous state legislators now and have been. There's legislation pending in 36 states to ban geoengineering over their skies. Tennessee and Florida have already done so. But we're correcting them and giving them an accurate compass heading that the localized, publicized cloud seeding operations, the kind which they tried to implicate in the Texas floods that killed so many young Americans, as being connected to a localized cloud seeding operation, which is virtually meaningless in comparison to climate engineering. It's an ant compared to an elephant. So intentionally, those that control media and are trying to control the narrative are trying to confuse these two issues. They are completely different. They're trying to mask or hide the elephant in the sky, which is climate engineering operations. So again, these programs are historical record. The Chinese government's so successful at, for example, engineering snowstorms. Tucker, do you remember the blizzard in New Orleans this January? Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
There was a blizzard in New Orleans, first time in recorded history. There was a blizzard in Florida, blizzards on the Gulf Coast. That was January 21st, by the way. That's an interesting date to have that happen. These are demonstrations of what climate engineering can do. And the Chinese government has long since openly stated they were engineering snowstorms with endothermic reacting elements. These are patented elements that can literally transition what should be a liquid precipitation event, a rain event, into snow. And these elements, if people understand they have a first aid kit that sits on their shelf at room temperature for 20 years, you mix the cold pack together, you have ice instantly. That's an endothermic reacting element.
Yes.
That's being split into cloud moisture. And they were so successful in China, they caused billions of dollars of damage to Beijing, at which time they began to be less open about this. Everybody covered it. CNN, Popular Science, The Guardian, everyone. But if you bring that up here, suddenly you're a tinfoil hat wearing nutcase. On that same day, while it was blizzarding in New Orleans, in the polar regions, Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, Siberia, it was above freezing and raining. Do you remember the deep freeze in Texas, Tucker, a few years ago, 5 years ago, something like that?
Yes, very well. Yeah, it shut down a lot of their grid.
Correct. So when it was below zero in Dallas, it was 33 degrees warmer at the North Pole. Think about that. And that's what we're not told. So when you have, let's look at the COP climate conferences. You know what those are? The international climate conferences that we have periodically. Those conferences are not to change business as usual. They are to force countries to actively or passively participate in climate engineering. So at some of those conferences, the Cancun conference, the Copenhagen conference, we had record low temperatures at the time of the conference in spite of above normal temperatures in all surrounding areas. That's a demonstration of what climate engineering can do. So back to the hurricanes. The deflection of hurricanes so far this year, is that a demonstration to other countries as well as to the power that the U.S. military has to manipulate atmospheric pressure zones? And again, these are patented processes. For listeners that have heard of HAARP in Alaska, I'm not sure if you ever heard of that, Tucker, HAARP?
No.
Okay, that's images of that exist. There's no dispute as to its function or what the patents outline that it can do. Even Discovery Channel did a long episode, which they've seemed to be taken off the air now, called Controlling the Weather. But that's a weapon of mass destruction. They play it off as a benign research facility. That's an ionosphere heater. It transmits 3.6 million watts of power to the electrically charged ionosphere, causing an electrical chain reaction. They're literally using the atmosphere as a physics lab, which we know they do, right, Tucker? You know of Project Starfish Prime and Project Fishbowl, if you've heard of those. Those are the U.S. military's experiments with detonating hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere, which they thought could collapse the whole atmosphere. Did that stop them? No, it didn't. So installations like HAARP are used to control atmospheric pressure zones. Back to the hurricanes, if you can manipulate atmospheric pressure zones with these directional ionosphere heaters, you can literally manipulate their path. And is that what we see going on? Is that a demonstration to others right now? Does the administration want to not have a big hurricane cataclysm since they've gutted all the emergency protection, everything? Do they not want to fight that battle too right now? We don't know. We can speculate on those things. But the fact that there is nothing that we can call natural at this point is indisputable.
That's amazing. A couple different threads. One, the U.S. military in this country, our military runs propaganda operations against our population, and they do it on social media. And of course, they do it through the conventional media as well, and they have for a long time. But it's certainly gotten more aggressive. So that's illegal. It's immoral. Anyone who participates in that should be in prison. But it happens, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to stop it. So we know that they lie to our population about a whole bunch of things, including what they're doing. Two, we know that in the past 15 years, you see these kind of fat, effeminate generals all of a sudden talking about how climate change is like one of the main national security threats, and like the purpose of the U.S. military is to fight climate change. There's been a lot of that, and it's very confusing to people like me who think of the purpose of the U.S. military as like shooting people trying to invade our country. Like, what does climate change have to do with national security? But they've been saying that a lot. And your description suddenly makes it all make sense. Like, a lot of what they do is trying to mitigate, or saying they're trying to mitigate, the effects of climate change. I mean, I guess this is more out in the open than I realized until right now.
I would call it masking the effects, because they're certainly not mitigating it. Everything they do, every short-term toxic surface cool down comes at the cost of a worsened overall warming and damage to the planet. And you're completely correct, Tucker, completely correct in the U.S. military top brass statements on the record that they consider the collapsing climate system the greatest national security threat of all. So when you have so many military bases at sea level, some of which are already being inundated, That's a part of the problem. But you have other elements, for example, and this is from a perspective of the existence of the human race and how much longer we're going to be here. The ozone layer is near functional collapse right now. It's not the hairspray cans. Single greatest damaging factor is climate engineering, period. Not just the oxidizing particles that are being dispersed in our atmosphere, but the manipulation of those particles with extremely powerful frequency transmissions. So we know that of all the towers being put up everywhere for, quote, communications, fake trees and, all the different forms they come in, we know that many of those installations are being supplied with 10 times more power than they need. That's part of my background in the electrical field. I know people that work on these towers. 10 times more power than they need for communications. Why do they need that much more power? 1,000% more power. And we know these facilities are being used to manipulate the electrically conductive atmospheric particulates. There's a repelling effect caused from these transmissions because we can see the effect on water vapor loops. So if we look at the flash flooding in Texas as an example that killed so many young Americans, we captured in real time, and I'm still surprised we have access to these data loops because we have access to the transmissions from the NextRad network that are used to manipulate weather systems. And what happened in that case was because of the repelling effect of those transmissions, and picture this scenario, when there was that convective cell over that location and transmitters energized all around that cell, and we recorded that, it's posted online. That, in effect, held that cell in one place. It precipitated out in one location. We can speculate about agendas and objectives. We can't know that. But the fact that that storm was manipulated is beyond dispute. Same with Hurricane Helene. We recorded that in real time. The frequency transmissions manipulating that storm and steering it into place. It's indisputable. These are patented technologies. Hurricane Harvey, we recorded that. How did meteorologists know 7 days in advance that Hurricane Harvey was going to go where it went and sit there for 3 days? How could they possibly know that? Frequency transmissions held it there. We recorded that in real time. And again, these people are reading scripts, Tucker. They're literally reading scripts passed down to them by Raytheon, private defense contractors Raytheon and Lockheed Martin that are neck deep in climate engineering, everything, patents, operations, everything. And they literally supply and provide the, quote, forecast, which is the scheduled weather, to the National Weather Service and NOAA, our nation's weathermen. That passes all the way down. And local meteorologists simply, they know how long their leash is. They're protecting their paychecks and pensions. They toe the line as well, just like the safe and effective in the medical community. Everybody just toes the line because they don't want to disrupt their personal paradigm. These storms are being steered and manipulated, period. That's beyond dispute.
I'm glad that you keep bringing up the COVID vax because it would be hard for my middle-aged brain to accept a lie at this scale. Like, how could you do that? How could you hide something this big, this profound from an entire population? Except I just saw it 5 years ago with the COVID vax, which was like a total lie. And now there's no dispute about the fact that they lied about it, but no one was ever punished and most people believed it. So I know for a fact what you're describing is possible. Can you, but actually before I forget, let me ask so who pays you to do this? Like this is quite an operation that you're running. You're clearly, I guess, not in it for the money. Like this is a bigger movement than I was aware until right now. So you're running lab tests on rainwater. You're researching this actively. Like, is this a volunteer effort? How and why are you doing this?
Because I can find no greater point for existing. How can I possibly look the other way? I was restoring habitat in Northern California, east side of Lake Shasta, habitat that was decimated by irresponsible logging practices. I wanted to do that the rest of my life. I wanted to plant trees and watch them grow the rest of my life.
Oh, good for God bless you.
I mean, there's no greater solitude than what I was doing. But how was I to continue doing that knowing what I knew? When the solar output reduction happened that I mentioned earlier, and I began to test rain, knowing the implications of toxic rain that contained aluminum. By the way, aluminum in regard to not just killing soil microbiome, but tree root systems. This is peer-reviewed study. Since that bioavailable aluminum, they shut down nutrient uptake. So the trees die a slow, protracted death And all official agencies blame beetles. The trees are dying because of the beetles. That's all we hear. And the bottom line is, beetles are a symptom of a sick, dead, dying tree. My father was an arborist. I know trees. I love trees. When I was in kindergarten, they had to come out after recess and drag me out of the tree because I didn't want to come down.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
I mean, with no trees, no people. That's simple,
Amen.
right?
That's right.
So how is I to continue doing that? I can't. I can't look myself in the mirror. I can't look my children in the eyes. How could I not do this? And if we carry this further, Tucker, you know the bees are collapsing, right?
Oh, of course. I know very well.
So we know this year we were told 70% collapse this year. That's staggering. That's incredibly alarming. But what's the real figure? The real figure is that's a 70% collapse of the 20% that was remaining. We're down to single-digit percentages of pollinators left right now. We know insect populations have declined. This is terrestrial and aquatic insect, 80 to 90% globally.
It's very noticeable. And if you don't believe it, remember the windshield on your parents' station wagon as a child in the summertime was covered in bugs. And that is not, I drive in a rural area every night and no bugs. That's real.
No bugs, no people. Also, we publicized this in 2012 with my work with former government scientists that could speak out because they were retired. And the science community tried to marginalize us. And now they've had to admit to it. If your listeners search insect apocalypse, they'll find the alarms going off all over the globe because this translates to plankton as well. No plankton, no people. We have peer-reviewed science study now from the Atlantic. Plankton population is down 90%. 90. Other oceans not far behind. That's the greatest oxygen producer on the planet. That is the base of life on Earth, plankton. We are the human race right now, Tucker. I've used this example before, but it sends a message that's very accurate. It's like occupants of a car parked on the railroad track. The train is seconds from impact, lights flashing, horn blaring, and they're trying to decide what station to put the radio on. I mean, no matter what other issue we're facing, and I would argue power structure maneuvering right now from conflict zones to carnage zones, many other factors are directly related to the unfolding and accelerating biosphere collapse, which climate engineering is fueling, not mitigating. It's fueling it, and they will not let go of this covert weapon of control. It is the crown jewel weapon with which they can, have been, and are bringing populations to their knees, including our own, without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault. They're not going to let go of this weapon. In regard to our military brothers and sisters that are participating in this, because many ask that question, why would they? But the bottom line is, and I've heard you say, I just heard you cite this, and I thank you for doing so, that our military brothers and sisters took an oath to protect their populations. I heard this on a former presentation you just made, to protect their populations from all threats, foreign and domestic. So they're being compartmentalized. They're being told that these programs are some benevolent, necessary operation. Just like the pilots in Vietnam, I'm sure were told when they were spraying Agent Orange on everybody. They're not told this is going to kill your comrade on the ground. Of course they're not told that. So here we are.
And I think in a lot of cases, people don't know. They don't think it through. I mean, again, they're so high on this false feeling of omnipotence, like we're in charge, we have the technology, we can make things better. I mean, people delude themselves. I think I know good people delude themselves into committing evil because, they think they have this power that they actually don't have. So, okay, the bees start disappearing, the bats, as you know, of course, insects, plankton. These are all phenomena that most people are not going to notice because they live in cities. They're not in touch with bees, okay, or insects. But the trees dying is very obvious. I mean, these are, plants that live for 100 years and all of a sudden they're dying. The fir trees are dying. Give us a sense of American forestry right now. Like, how are the trees in this country?
I think the more important statistic might be globally at this point because we have that statistic. Tree cover has declined since pre-civilization baselines, 66%. 66% gone. The remaining 1/3 is dead and dying. Trees, we've changed atmospheric chemistry so much. Forests do not smell like forests anymore. Anybody who knows trees and knows what forests once smelled like,
yes,
knows that scent is gone. Why is it gone? Because of the now intense UV radiation that's bombarding the planet. And we're getting, by the way, UVC in the surface. I mentioned the ozone layer collapse, climate engineering, single greatest factor. And the climate science community acknowledges this, by the way, Tucker. They acknowledge openly, if we geoengineer, as if we haven't been for 80 years already, by the way, these programs were immediately deployed after World War II. That's how long they've been ongoing. But the science community openly admits that if we were to geoengineer, it would destroy the ozone layer. We had a former NASA contract engineer working directly for geoengineeringwatch.org with state-of-the-art metering equipment into 5 figures we supplied. And again, we do this out of pocket. We don't monetize anything. Our film, The Dimming, the groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, which is the standard on this issue, 26 million views, non-monetized, posted for free the day it was done. I'm in this for the cause. If we don't win this battle, nothing else matters. And back to the trees the forest that doesn't smell like forest anymore, because the trees are shutting their stomata. That's a respiratory port on the trees, allowing them to breathe, to feed on carbon, to release oxygen. They are not respirating. They're dying a slow, protracted death. That's the second greatest oxygen producer on the planet. Again, from every conceivable direction, climate engineering is pounding the nails into our collective coffins, but they will not let go of this covert weapon of control. And for those that say they wouldn't do this to themselves, again, they already have. We detonated 2,400 nuclear bombs on the planet. How many people know that? The Nevada detonations, which they did in total secrecy, right? We know now from peer-reviewed study, the downwind fallout from the Nevada nuclear bomb detonations killed no less than 700,000 Americans. That's peer-reviewed study. How many people know that? So again, they don't care about the consequences of what they do. We know as far as biological testing, according to the Washington Post, as of 1977, U.S. military had conducted no less than 239 open-air biological tests on innocent, unknowing civilians.
Oh, come on now. Biological warfare tests on Americans?
Yeah, I know you know. You must know that. Look it up. I mean, this is historical record. Again, covered by mainstream media.
We had a revolution over a tea tax, dude. I feel like this. You can't put up with this. I encourage all of your listeners to look up every single thing I state. That is very easy to find that statistic. Washington Post first published that in 1977. I hope it's clear from the statistics I'm citing. I'm not shooting from the hip. So again, this is business as usual, and why people can't face that is perplexing. And let's look at Zbigniew Brzezinski. I know you know who he is, former U.S. presidential advisor, going all the way back to Johnson. What did he state in the record? Your listeners can look this up very easily as well. He stated, with today's technology, it's far easier to kill 1 million people than to control them. You think these people are here to help? Really? So again, I want to stress that the amount of layers with this issue, and there's many legitimate causes of concerns at this point in time. If we don't deal with what's happening in our skies, we're not going to be here long. And let's look at, if we could look at COVID for a moment, we know that, for one, the world's second most recognized climate engineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, former DOD scientist, we own an audio of him at geoengineeringwatch.org. In his words, stating what he did for the DOD was to design methods of spraying pathogens into clouds to infect the populations below. We know in the outbreak of CV-19, at one point, 85 countries were infected in 3 days. That's indicative of an airborne dispersion. We know from Italian researchers, they found CV-19 attached to airborne particulates. Do not all these dots connect? They certainly would appear so. We know from our precipitation testing, we have polymer fibers and graphene in our rain. Graphene is like a vascular machete. I mean, it's listed in geoengineering patents for certain purposes. Again, they don't care about the consequences, but those two elements also, Tucker, are used militarily as biological carrier platforms to carry a pathogen from the clouds to the ground to infect the population below. Why is that in our rain right now? Could they, at any point of their choosing, put something much more lethal into the precipitation and level the playing field? Certainly they could. This is also shocking. Have you spoken to elected officials about this, members of Congress?
Many, and I continue to, and many know. I've had private meetings with Gavin Newsom at the California State Capitol, his top aide, and not that individual would ever do anything for the common good. He wouldn't. He's there to serve those who have him on the end of their strings. No response there. I have on my desk.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So you actually said this or a version of this to Gavin Newsom, the governor of California?
Yes. And in fact, and what I conveyed to Newsom also, if these programs were allowed to continue, because I was focused more on the state of California and the impact here, that the drought catastrophes in California would be catastrophic. I supplied data, which he didn't try to dispute, because I've had meetings with California Energy Commission scientists as well, air quality scientists. California's been concerned about, of course, the lack of precipitation, which affects our hydro power production, also affects Hoover Dam, H Canyon Dam. But if your listeners looked at presentations I gave well over a decade ago, engineered drought catastrophe, target California, everything I said in those presentations back then is more relevant now than ever. Presented that data to Newsom, and the drought has continued, which they're not even disclosing now. Even in Northern California right now, they show zero drought. That's a blatant, glaring statistical falsification. It has never been drier here in regard to soil moisture and fire fuel moisture. They're lying about everything. They're lying about the UV readings on the surface. Blatant, glaring lies. We know about every single aspect of this equation. They're disclosing and metering only down to 300 nanometers in regard to the UV spectrum. That's half of the UVB spectrum. No UVC is even metered for, let alone disclosed. Same as the air quality particulates. PM10 is looked for, nothing below that. I've had California state air quality officials in a closed door meeting, 5 of them, tell me to my face, the system is rigged. We're testing for combustion particulates only. The rest goes out the window. Whole system by design to not show the immensity of damage being done. So back to Newsom and those officials, no response. Yes, they know. The Palisades fire, I'm sure that's fresh in your mind, right?
Very.
The ability for the climate engineers to shut off precipitation is far greater even than their ability to augment it. They can shut down rain as long as they want, as we know from the Middle Eastern countries, as I just stated on Iran. So in the case of the Palisades, no rain for 8 months. It's not an accident. These particulates are incendiaries. Aluminum nanoparticles are such an effective incendiary. They're used in military demolitions, thermite. That incendiary dust coats the forest floor, coats foliage. And when that builds up over time, that makes everything more volatile as well. I spoke about atmospheric pressure zones, which they can and are manipulating. And in doing so, they can manipulate surface wind flows, creating extreme zonal wind flow patterns, same as they did in Lahaina. Same thing, extremely anomalous low pressure zones, one to the north, which was an engineered high pressure zone, to the south, Hurricane Dora. Between those two, you create a bellows effect, a blowtorch effect, whatever the source of ignition. And many online speculate about that in very fringe ideas of what might cause the ignition. Again, that's irrelevant. What's setting the template for these fires to burn with such ferocity? And that is definitely climate engineering. And I'll leave it with this. We found a 140-page U.S. military document, which we posted, titled Wildfires as a Military Weapon. Within that document, 17 sites were named in the U.S. as study zones. LA was one. And in that described exactly the type of pre-preparation that we see happening in all these locations. Lahaina was declared a flash drought zone a week prior to that incineration. So we can speculate on the agendas and objectives being carried out. The fact that climate engineering is inseparable from these equations is absolutely indisputable. That document, by the way, also posted at geoengineeringwatch.org with the important sections highlighted. Shocking data.
Has there been any attempt to push back legislatively? Like, has the Congress ever taken this up?
Yes. Again, we have 36 states with legislation in some process. 2 states have already passed it. I'm communicating with an aide to DeSantis. I've had an hour conference call with Latipo there on the issue. We have some very rational people involved. He is. Yep. He very much is. His whole team was on the call. We've had Marjorie Taylor Greene just address this. That was publicized well. We tried to reach Mrs. Greene before this to try to give some compass heading, because if you fly into this blind, it's you can do more harm than good. And one thing we encourage, and unfortunately, Marjorie didn't get this message. We hope she does at some point. Don't open the entire climate scenario and mix it with this issue. And that's what she did. We want to keep the focus on climate engineering. And when there's a denial of the other sources of damage to the planet, that tends to immediately alienate half the people we need in this battle. So what we would try to encourage other legislators to do is, if the subject of the climate comes up, that how can we have any legitimate discussion of climate, anything, from any perspective, without first and foremost addressing this elephant in the equation? And that narrative is much more productive at building bridges instead of burning them.
So, I knew the climate was changing, of course, because I pay attention to nature. But you've just single-handedly convinced me that a lot of this is driven by human activity, just not your Suburban and your hairspray. It's driven by the U.S. military.
Well, it's both. Though I want to stress again, we're not denying at GeoengineeringWatch.org that, again, statistically, we are putting about 100 million tons of carbon into the air a day, 26 million tons of coal, 100 million barrels of hydrocarbon. We're cutting down the forests. We're paving the planet. We're poisoning the oceans. All of these things have an effect. We're acknowledging that. But we're saying when we have intentional intervention, which has prevented the planet from responding to the damage done, if it weren't for toxic rain, Tucker, the forests may have tried to uptake more of that carbon and to keep things more in balance, but they can't. The trees can't. Their root systems are being poisoned, soil microbiome being poisoned, ozone layer being destroyed. These programs are literally disabling the planet's counterbalancing life support systems. So we will never know now how much better a position we would have been in had climate engineering, aka weather warfare, let's call it what it is. It's weather warfare. Had these programs never been deployed, we will now never know how much better a position we might have been in. But those in power, again, do not care about the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. And we know that from psychoanalysis. I've looked at this from a psychoanalysis standpoint, and it specifically cites the kind of personality disorders that exist with those in power have a common thread. And that common thread is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. That's a power addict. And I know you
correct.
More than anybody in the world. Does an addict care? We're dealing with a headless, heartless, soulless cancer at this point. And does an addict care the next fix may kill them? They don't care. And at this point, it's a runaway train. So for many people that walk away saying they would never do this to themselves, they already have. We know this from the nuclear scenario I outlined. And if I could tie one more dot together, forgive me, but this is important because it's an existential threat. I outlined that climate engineering is decimating the planet's primary protective life support system, starting with the ozone layer. Now we're much more susceptible to a CME, a coronal mass ejection solar flare. If we have an event like the Carrington event in the 1800s, that would shut down grid power around the world. Now we have nuclear plants that can't cool themselves. Now we have Fukushima times 100 or 200. Game over. Yeah. Again, directly connected to climate engineering.
What is the effect on animal populations? You mentioned bees, plankton, and other insects, but what about mammals? Do you notice any effect?
Yes. We have peer-reviewed study of whales that have extraordinary amounts of aluminum in their tissue. Where's that coming from? This is bioavailable aluminum. And you might hear the attempt to debunk this is to say, well, aluminum's a very common element, which it is. It's the third most abundant in the Earth's strata, but it does not exist in free form naturally, period.
Yes, that's correct.
Always bonded to other elements. So that's the part that they leave out. So when you have even whales absorbing this same material, having an obvious effect in regard to overall global animal populations, wildlife populations, down conservatively about 75% in the last 40 years alone. That's 75% of an already depleted population. The giant herds of caribou, you've seen films of that, right? Tucker, 1 million strong. Some of those herds were 1 million. They're down to 5,000 or less from 1 million. Virtual crash. And we have some extraordinary images from what chemical ice nucleation can do. It is profound when you have an endothermic reaction, you know what an exothermic reaction is. You have this massive energy release, the splitting of an atom being the epitome of that. But an endothermic reaction is profound in many ways as well. So we have images of, for example, hundreds of waterfowl frozen solid to the surface of a lake. How does that happen? Tucker, you've seen the massive baseball and softball size hail falling everywhere, right?
Yes.
So much so that insurance companies are canceling any hail coverage now because it's increased so profoundly. That's chemical ice nucleation. The extreme form, if your listeners searched Lake Michigan ice balls, they can see the shores of Lake Michigan coated with 75-pound, perfectly spherical ice balls. They don't fall that big from the sky. They form that way in the ocean because they're chemically nucleating over the Great Lakes constantly. That's how they pile up these massive amounts of snow in Erie and Buffalo, and they make sensationalized headlines. You can literally throw a rock to no snow, but they only show the 4 feet or 5 feet of snow in Erie and in Buffalo and sensationalize. Look how much snow there is while we're 80 degrees at the top of the Sierras in the middle of winter in California. They don't publicize that. Do you remember, Tucker, when Boston had the record lows, 2014, I think, Boston had record lows and they really sensationalized all the snow? What didn't they tell us? Middle of winter, while Boston was buried in snow, it was literally no snow, 14,000 feet up in the Sierras. They never told us about that, did they? So again, there's a perception aspect in this too. Keeping business as usual until the last possible moment, until the moment of impact, being able to retain their power in this way while using weather as a weapon. But the crops are shutting down as well. Globally, we have crop collapse happening everywhere. Same scenario. They're shutting their stomata. They're not feeding. They're not absorbing carbon. They're not releasing oxygen. So again, this is a ubiquitous contamination.
I think the first step is to let people know the facts that you just laid out and to have a public debate about it. It always begins with words, anything good. So could you just end by telling us, for people who have made it to this portion of the interview and want to know more, can you speak slowly and direct them to where they can get more information on this?
Geoengineeringwatch.org strives to be a data repository on this issue. And the only way we can move this fight forward is to share credible data from a credible source. And we strive to be that source. I have one goal, one mission. I live for the day when what's happening in our skies is fully exposed and halted, which, Tucker, I would argue we can only do from the inside out. The legislation is good because it puts it on the radar, but it's symbolic. They're not going to stop DoD operations from that. Only by pushing this issue to the full light of day can we cause a shockwave around the world so that populations in countries all over the world understand what their governments have either actively or passively done to them without their knowledge or consent. And in doing so, our military brothers and sisters would hopefully awaken to what they're doing to their countrymen. And one would hope would stand down. I know we have the Milgram experiments as an example of most human beings, if they're being told by someone they perceive an authority, will carry out almost any form of atrocity. And we need to get past that. But if we can fully expose this, the fur will fly. I would argue we would alter the equation and drag many other issues with it. Issues like 9/11 or the safe and effective, because you can't hide what's happening in our sky. There's many issues that people can and try to put in the rearview mirror. You can't do that with this. It's getting worse by the day. The damage done is getting worse by the day. But if we share credible data from a credible source, that's much more effective at waking people up than running out in the street, pointing at the sky and ranting. If they can look at satellite images, which we capture, the moment we see them on the NASA satellite feed, we capture them because they try to scrub them off. We have satellite images that are beyond shocking, that you don't need to know anything about meteorology to know something very radical and very wrong is going on. And we put that on our printed materials, which we distribute to all legislators, and we supply them for activists and populations. There's about 500,000 of our 20-page booklets in circulation right now. We're trying desperately to give visuals, which are a much better key to the door. We're trying desperately, again, with legislators to not open up the whole climate condition front or climate change front. Stick to this issue. Stick to this. And we can't have a discussion about climate unless or until we deal with this first. We take this out of the equation, then we can assess where we're at. So again, by knowing how to play chess, by knowing the chessboard, We need to play effectively and efficiently. And if we can do that and start spot fires of awareness, ask others to do the same, we will put enough holes in the dam that those in power can't plug the leaks, and we will push this issue to the full light of day. And if we can do that, we will alter the equation. And again, time is not on our side. We can avoid a toxic medical concoction injection. We can avoid a lot of things. We have to breathe. Every breath we take is filled with these nanoparticles. In fact, we have peer-reviewed study to prove that as well. And we have, in the case of the nanoplastics, the climate science community is now starting to admit to that. They're showing up in human brains, lungs, placenta, everything, every human organ. And again, we know that these particles are not just a result of plastic decomposition in the environment, because our testing with RPI in New York conclusively proved that the particles we found were manufactured. That means, and they can tell with their spectroscopy, watching too much Porky Pig. They know that. So bottom line is, we're dealing with the ubiquitous contamination of the planet. And if we can't breathe without inhaling that, the ramifications are beyond grave. That's a fight for life right here, right now.
Yeah. Are you spraying chemicals into the air without telling me using my tax dollars? Simple question that I plan to start asking people in leadership positions. So I don't know how I made it this long without knowing all of this, but I'm grateful for this conversation, and I hope it sparks a national conversation and some outrage. Dane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tucker. Thank you so much for your voice. Thank you to your team. The importance of you and your team at this critical moment in human history cannot be overstated. And we at Geoengineering Watch and our platforms, which are much smaller than yours, we 250,000 followers is all nothing compared to yours, but everybody in our ranks is 1,000% behind you, brother.
Well, that's so nice. Thank you. We want to be helpful. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Since we